Welcome back to Reformed Thinking. Today we're going to get into a topic that really you can't understand the Old Testament without it. We're talking about the land.
And it's so much more than just a piece of real estate, right?
Mhm.
It's the entire theological stage.
Right.
The sources we're looking at today track it from divine ownership all the way to how prophecy redefined the whole thing.
Yeah, and if you think you can just bypass this topic, well, you're missing a huge piece of the puzzle. The sheer frequency of the word in Hebrew is, well, it's pretty staggering.
It really is. I mean, Moshe Weinfeld's observation is a great starting point. The Hebrew word, iria, which means both land and earth, is the fourth most common word in the entire Old Testament.
The fourth.
The fourth. That's not an accident.
It
It
did.
tells you right away that this is absolutely central to how the Bible thinks and tells its story. It's the stage where redemption happens.
Okay, so let's start where the Bible starts, right at the top. The absolute sovereignty of God, or I am, over the earth, over.
Right. So the sources lay out that I am is the one and only owner of the earth. And he makes this claim in two distinct ways. It's a dual claim. And it's not just a philosophical idea, it's what drives the history.
So the first claim is the most obvious one, I suppose. Owner by creation.
Exactly. He made it, so he owns it. Simple as that. But there's a nuance here that the sources point out, which I think is fascinating. As the creator, he owns everything, but he keeps a kind of transcendence over it. He reserves the heavens for himself, and he gives the earth to humankind.
An act of grace.
A total act of grace. We're placed here on area as, you could say, God's appointed managers or regents. Our job is to cultivate it, to build culture, to reflect his own image back onto his own property.
But we can never forget who holds the actual title deed.
Never. The earth is not ours. The psalmist says it plainly. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it. So our entire existence here is one of borrowed stewardship.
And that stewardship has conditions, which I think leads us straight into the second claim. Owner by conquest. This is where God's ownership gets demonstrated in history.
Yes, this is so critical. He doesn't just own the land because he made it in the distant past. He actively takes possession of it as the divine warrior. This is key to understanding how Israel got there.
It wasn't their own military strength.
Not at all. The land is given to them through Joshua's sword, yes, but I am is the one wielding it. He is the victor who goes before them, fighting this holy war against the Canaanites.
And you can see this tying together the creative right and the historical action. I'm thinking of the Song of the Sea in Exodus. After Egypt is defeated, Moses sings that God will plant his people on his holy mountain.
Which is a reference to Zion, and by extension, the whole land. So you see, the creation claim and the conquest claim are locked together. The land is doubly his by right of creation and by right of redemptive conquest.
So as the absolute owner, he's also the one who distributes the property.
He's the ultimate distributor. You see this hinted at the Table of Nations in Genesis 10. The idea is that God is the one who parcels out the earth, setting the boundaries for all the nations, deciding where they should live.
So a nation's possession of a territory is never based on their own strength or their own inherent right.
Never. It's always a divine assignment. And if God is the one who assigns, well, he also has the right to reassign.
Which brings us to this idea of sovereign replacement and judgment.
This is so important for understanding God's justice. He has the sovereign right to, well, to evict old owners and bring in new ones. And this wasn't some special rule just for Israel.
The sources cite a pattern, right?
Yeah.
Even before Israel showed up.
Exactly. Before Israel ever got to Canaan, God had already replaced the Emites with the Moabites and the Horites with the Edomites. So this principle of displacement was already an established divine policy. It showed everyone that ownership is conditional.
So when it comes to the Canaanites being replaced by Israel, there's a very specific reason given.
An absolutely clear reason. God replaced them because of the wickedness of those nations. It was a moral judgment. In fact, the grant to Abraham was actually put on hold, delayed, because as Genesis says, the iniquity of the Amorites was not yet full.
So God waited. He waited until their corruption was, you might say, ripe for judgment.
Yes, and that frames the whole conquest in a different light. It's not primarily a political act to favor Israel. It's an act of God's holiness against deep systemic sin. Israel just happens to be the instrument he uses to carry out the judgment.
That makes so much sense. It means the land itself has a kind of moral framework.
It does. It can't tolerate certain levels of idolatry and corruption. It, as the text says, eventually vomit out its inhabitants. The whole thing moves from just being about ancient warfare to being about divine order.
And that idea of order is a perfect pivot to the next point. The meaning of the land that goes beyond just territory. its existential and sociological symbolism.
Right, because the reason land is such a powerful theme is that it taps into this really deep yearning we all have. The need for a home, the need to be in a safe, settled, predictable place.
It's a basic human psychological need for stability.
Absolutely. And Brueggemann makes the point that Hiri is way more than just geographical space. It's a place of memory, a place for a meaningful life. It's what gives you roots, identity, a story that continues through generations. Without the land, a people are adrift.
And this need for a home, for a place, connects to the bigger theological idea of order versus chaos.
Yes, that's the core contrast. The land symbolizes the move from a disordered, wandering life to one with ordered, governed structures. It stands for a world benevolently ordered by God for human security and flourishing.
To really get the value of that order, though, you have to understand its opposite, which is what Israel experienced first, the wilderness.
The wilderness is the complete antithesis of a normal human society. It's described as formless, lifeless. It has none of the supports or resources that give life meaning and structure.
And that's why it's such a potent place for testing faith.
Exactly. Because in the wilderness, you have nothing else. You are thrown into a state of pure, moment-by-moment dependence on God. It's where you either remember his promises about the land, or you forget them and start wishing you were back in Egypt.
So the land is the foundation for human flourishing. It's a cultural center.
Right. It provides the stability you need to produce food, to raise animals, to create wealth, and to multiply. It allows people to actually be culture makers.
To fulfill that original mandate to be God's regents.
You can't really do that from a tent in the desert. You need stability. Law, art, established worship, all of that requires a settled place. The land is the prerequisite, the stage where a righteous society is meant to live out its calling in God's presence. It's a mirror of the garden.
Okay, so we've established who the owner is, and we've talked about what the property means. Now we get to the terms of the agreement, so to speak, the dual covenant structure.
And this duality is maybe the single most helpful concept for making sense of Israel's story. As Gerhard von Rad pointed out, God's call to Abraham to go to Canaan with the promise of that land, that one event basically sets the course for the entire Old Testament.
That's the foundation, the unconditional grant.
Yes, the Abrahamic covenant. This establishes an eternal right to the land given purely by God's election. It guarantees Israel's existence and their eventual possession of the land forever.
So this is a promise that can't be broken.
It can't. Even when Israel fails in the most spectacular ways, even when they're judged and exiled, that original promise remains the unshakable basis for their future redemption. God's faithfulness to his own promise is what guarantees their future, not their own faithfulness.
And Abraham's role here is just foundational. His journey out of his homeland is one of the two big events that forms Israel.
Right. You have Abraham's exodus, which sets the goal Canaan, and then you have Moses' exodus from Egypt, which accomplishes the liberation needed to get to that goal.
But this unconditional grant has a partner, doesn't it? And that's the conditional tenure under the Mosaic covenant.
Exactly. This is the other side of the coin. The Abrahamic promise ensures they will possess the land, but the Mosaic law defines how they must live in the land.
And this is where that legal term comes in. Usufruct. It's a bit technical, but it's essential here.
It is, but the concept is pretty straightforward. Usufruct basically means you have the right to use and enjoy the profits of a property that you don't own.
So Israel gets the usus, the use of the land, and the fructus, the fruits or profits. They get all the benefit.
All the benefits. But God retains what's called the abusus, the right to dispose of the property. He holds the title deed. So their enjoyment of the land is completely conditional on their faithfulness to the covenant, their obedience to the Torah.
And if they break that covenant,
he reserves the right to withdraw the gift. Not permanently, the Abrahamic promise holds, but temporarily, which is exactly what exile is.
You can see this usufruct status playing out in Israel's daily life, like with the sabbatical and Jubilee years.
Oh, absolutely. Every 7 years, the land has to rest. Every 50 years, all land goes back to its original family owners. These cycles were constant, built-in reminders that they were not the ultimate owners. They were just managers living under God's rules.
And God even defines their status using this kind of language. He calls them aliens and tenants living with me.
Right. The Hebrew words ger and tujah, they point to a temporary dependent status. They are guests on God's property. They are under his protection, but they are accountable to him for how they use his land.
This all creates a really interesting tension in Israel's identity because they aren't just tenants, they're also called God's sons.
And that's the core tension. It mirrors the covenant structure perfectly. On one hand, you have what you could call the indicative mood. It's unconditional. The fact that Israel is God's son is a fixed reality rooted in his choice. They don't earn that
But
status.
then there's the other side.
Then there's the imperative mood, which is conditional. Each generation has to actively obey God to enjoy the rights and blessings of being faithful sons. A son who rebels doesn't stop being a son.
But he loses his privileges.
Exactly. He loses the benefits, he faces discipline, and this tension explains pretty much all of Israel's history. God never gives up on the indicative. He never revokes their election. But he absolutely enforces the imperative through judgment and discipline.
It's a key idea in Reformed thought, too, isn't it? The relationship between our unchangeable status and justification and the required obedience of sanctification.
It's the exact same pattern. We are forever his children, but we can still be grounded, so to speak, if we violate the household rules.
Okay, let's move from the legal structure to the actual place itself, the specific land grant, Canaan and Zion.
Right, so the heartland promised to Israel is Canaan. God swears an oath to give to Abraham and his descendants as a royal land grant forever. This promise is repeated over and over again.
And the sources are pretty clear about the geographic boundaries. This wasn't some vague mythical place.
No, not at all. It was a real territory with defined borders. The desert in the south, the Mediterranean Sea in the west, specific mountains in the north, and the Jordan River and Dead Sea on the east. A tangible, physical piece of land.
And the descriptions of it are just incredible. A land flowing with milk and honey.
And that's not just poetry, it's theology. The sources note that the inheritance included houses that Israel did not build, wells they did not dig, and orchards they did not plant.
Which again reinforces the idea that it's all a gift, it's grace, it's meant to stop them from thinking they earned it themselves.
Right, and then within this special land, there's one spot that becomes even more distinct: Zion, God's unique earthly residence.
Jerusalem.
Which becomes Jerusalem, yes. It's called the city of God because the great king lives there. The holiness of the entire land sort of flows outward from this one central point of God's presence.
And the history of that spot is just layered with meaning. It's identified as the same mountain where Abraham was told to sacrifice Isaac.
Which is just incredible. It connects the central promise of the Abrahamic covenant, the oath God swore to Abraham there, directly to the central place of worship for the entire nation.
And then David brings the ark there and establishes it as the place for the temple.
And at the temple's dedication, God takes up residence. He declares it his resting place forever. The entire glory and security of that city comes from one fact: God chooses to live there among his people. The holiness of the land comes from the presence of the landowner.
So the gift is given, the conditions are set, the location is identified, but as we know, Israel continuously failed to meet the requirements of their tenancy. Which brings us to the tests of fidelity in their history.
Right. The sources really frame Israel's failures as a series of 3 distinct tests, starting with the first one in the wilderness, the testing by want.
The wilderness, being the opposite of the land, was the perfect training ground, or at least it was supposed to be. It was designed to force total dependence on God and his word, not on bread alone.
But that first generation failed comprehensively. You see it in the constant murmuring, the quarreling, the fear, always wanting to go back to the slavery of Egypt because at least there was food.
And the ultimate failure at Kadesh Barnea, a failure of courage, which was really a failure of faith in the one who promised to give them the land.
And that failure led to 40 years of wandering. So if that first test was about having nothing, the second test was the opposite, the land test, the testing by prosperity.
Once they're in Canaan, the gift itself becomes the source of temptation. They start to forget the giver.
Moses warned them this would happen. In Deuteronomy, he lays out the specific temptation, that prideful thought: my power and the strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me.
It's a complete denial of their usufruct status. It's them trying to claim the title deed for themselves.
Precisely. And their faithfulness in the land was tested by their obedience to the Torah. That meant giving the tithes, offering the sacrifices, observing the feasts, all of which were constant reminders that the fruit of the land wasn't really theirs. They were just giving a portion back to the true owner.
It also required them to finish the job of dispossessing the Canaanites.
Yes, and that wasn't about random violence. It was about spiritual hygiene, to prevent contamination. God knew that if they coexisted with Canaanite idolatry, it would corrupt them, and the land would eventually eject them, just as the covenant curses warned.
And since they failed both the test of scarcity and the test of prosperity, the inevitable result was the third test, the test of exile and judgment.
Right. The judgment itself becomes another phase of testing. The exiles are tested in the furnace of affliction. The land literally throws them out for breaking the terms of the covenant.
And the sources point to a critical internal reason for this failure, the false prophets of Zion.
They played a huge role in the nation's downfall. They kept giving the people lying visions of peace and security. They refused to expose the depth of the people's sin.
So they prevented any real repentance that might have changed the outcome.
Exactly. They offered cheap grace, and it led to ruin. And this collective failure, this refusal to repent, meant that the judgment had to be intensified. And this brings us to a really interesting part of the sources, the sacred numbers and how they relate to prophecy.
The sacred semiotics of 7.
Right. The number 7 in Scripture is a symbol of divine perfection, of completion. You see it everywhere. The 7 days of creation, the Sabbath cycle. When you see 7, you should think a complete finished work.
And that extends to the number 70.
Yes. 70 is the product of 2 sacred numbers, 7 for perfection and 10 for fullness. So 70 represents a kind of complete, divinely administered period of time, especially when it comes to judgment.
Which is why Jeremiah prophesies a 70-year exile in Babylon.
It's presented as a standard sentence for rebellion, a complete period of time for penitence, to let the land have its Sabbaths that Israel had denied it.
But then Daniel takes that number and multiplies it.
This is where it gets really layered. Daniel's vision in chapter 9 takes that 70-year period and multiplies it by 7. 70 times 7, or 490 years.
And why that multiplication? What does that signify?
Well, it ties directly back to the covenant curses in Leviticus 26. God warns that if Israel keeps disobeying, he will punish them 7 times more for their sins. So this multiplication means that this new era of judgment is going to be the ultimate, complete, and final one, all leading up to a climactic event in the fullness of time.
And this period of 77s was set to accomplish some very specific things.
6 specific things, yes,
Yeah.
including to anoint the most holy, to bring in everlasting righteousness, and to put a final end to sin. It's a divinely decreed timetable for the climax of redemption and judgment.
And the prophecy gives a very specific signpost. It says, after the 62 sevens, the anointed one will be cut off and will have nothing.
Which finds its clear fulfillment in the rejection and crucifixion of Jesus Christ by his own people. The entire system, land, law, prophecy, was pointing to him. He was meant to be the one who would finally bring everlasting righteousness to the land. Instead, he was executed in the land.
That signals a major shift in how all these promises are going to be fulfilled.
A radical shift. You know, Daniel, even while he was in exile in Babylon, he would pray 3 times a day, facing toward Jerusalem. That act was a statement of faith, a loyalty not just to a city, but to the entire divine destiny tied to that sacred place. The hope persisted, even when they were cut off from the land itself.
And that persistence of hope, even outside the physical borders, that's a perfect transition to our final section, looking beyond the historical reality to the eschatological land.
Right, because we have to acknowledge that while the land promises were fulfilled in part under Joshua and then later under David and Solomon, they were never fully consummated. The ideal, permanent, unending rest never really happened.
Which suggests the historical land was always pointing to something more.
Exactly. It suggests there is still a future consummation of that sworn land for the people of God, a final, unending rest.
So the ideal isn't just Canaan. The ideal is the regenerated earth, the new heavens and new earth, where God's people will enjoy his presence without any barriers.
The promise extends beyond the original borders of Canaan to become a promise of a new world of security and blessing.
And even in the periods after the temple was destroyed, you see this passionate focus on a future, glorious restoration of Zion. It led to a rethinking of what Zion even was.
It did. Later literature starts to talk about a heavenly Jerusalem, one that existed before creation and served as the pattern for the earthly city. It shows that the ultimate reality of the land is not bound to our current historical order.
So eventually the whole concept of the land was spiritualized.
Yes, to refer to the life to come, the world to come after the resurrection. It came to represent the ultimate inheritance, which is intimate fellowship with God himself.
And you can see that idea foreshadowed with the Levites, can't you? They received no land inheritance in Canaan.
An amazing foreshadowing. Their inheritance was I am himself. They were perpetual tenants and sojourners in the land, living off the offerings given to God. It demonstrates that fellowship with the owner is a far greater inheritance than a deed to the property.
It creates this beautiful theological path. The physical land was the preparatory stage, always pointing toward the eternal reality of dwelling with the owner.
That's it, exactly.
So, after all this, what does it all mean for us today? We've traced this huge structure, this tension between the certainty of the Abrahamic gift and the accountability of the Mosaic enjoyment.
Well, it means that our relationship with God as Christians still contains that same tension. Our standing, our election as God's children is absolutely secure. It's unconditional, rooted in his saving work. That's the indicative mood. We're justified.
But our enjoyment of the blessings of that status is conditional on our faithfulness, our obedience. That's the imperative.
Right. We have to obey to experience the fullness of what it means to be a child of the King and to avoid the discipline of a holy father. The Old Testament story of the land is the grand stage where God demonstrated this reality for all time. He is faithful to his promise, but he is just as faithful to his justice when we corrupt the gift he's given us.
It's a reminder that everything we have, our homes, our resources, our security, it's all part of God's here. We're living in a state of usufruct. We're tenants.
And that leads to the final question, the one for you to think about. How do these Old Testament teachings about the land shape your spiritual life? How do they guide your obedience while you live as an alien and a tenant in this present world? If the physical land required total dependence and faithfulness from Israel, how much more does the spiritual life require our constant, faith-filled accountability to the divine owner of all things?